It's time once again to check in and see how your belief systems are doing. Are you ready? Ready or not, here we go. Do you believe that you have an inner core that seeks expansion? Do you believe that you have two minds, the conscious and the unconscious? Do you believe that each mind has its own personality and that these two personalities must work together? Do you believe in the power and magic of fantasy to transform the potential into the actual? Last but not least, do you believe that what you use to fill the gaps in awareness ultimately determines whether you achieve self-health or self-sabotage? If you answered yes to these questions, then this prescription is doing its job, as it is effectively helping you break free of some of the mindsets that until now have separated you from yourself. By breaking free of mindsets and reclaiming the self, you automatically become empowered to think more creatively, remember more effortlessly, and focus more purposefully. Not only does answering yes to these questions help you break free of certain mindsets and reclaim the self, it also makes it easier for you to travel into the deeper recesses of inner space. Answering yes to these questions says you have increased your awareness potential by doing away with some of the limiting beliefs that previously restricted your range of consciousness. Changing your belief systems to include the ideas contained in this prescription will empower your awareness by infusing your associative matrix with new patterns of thought. This infusion of thought will better prepare you to navigate your way through the social and instinctual forces that drive you as a mind, body, and spirit. Best of all, these new thought patterns will galvanize your mind so you can benefit from Part 10. This is important because Part 10 is your ticket to understanding choice and the role it plays in self-development. So cash in your ticket by continuing to listen and learn why it is of the essence that you choose wisely when it comes to your self-health. The first step in understanding the choice process is realizing that no matter how large or small, every choice you make makes a difference when it comes to divining your destiny. This is because the choices you make reverberate throughout your lifetime. In other words, every choice you make will, in one way or another, sooner or later, promote the toxic or the nurturing, ego consciousness or self-reflective consciousness, self-health or self-sabotage. Simply put, the choices we make determine how much of our growth potential we realize. This is the case because the choices we make activate a co-evolutionary process between the inner and outer worlds. This co-evolution of the inner and outer worlds, which is activated by our choices, is what triggers our potential, be it good or bad. Co-evolution defined is the process whereby the innate potential of the inner world is activated by the outer world. This activated potential in turn affects the outer world, which then reverberates and comes back to further affect the inner world. This process goes on indefinitely. Therefore, choices, because they fuel the co-evolution process, make all the difference when it comes to fulfilling our potential. The influence of choice on your potential is so momentous that it is best illustrated by sharing a story with you about the first time I visited my wife's grandmother's house. When we arrived at the house, my wife quickly pointed out that the two palm trees in the front yard had been planted at the same time. She did this to draw my attention to one specific detail, the fact that the one tree was almost 4 times the size of the other. She then told me that the one tree in the middle of the yard was larger because it had greater access to water and sunshine. Although the tree in the middle of the yard had no choice as to its position, it nonetheless had an advantage over the other palm tree. The larger tree's position relative to the outer world allowed it to co-evolve in such a way that it could draw more of the life-giving forces. Likewise, your position as a human self-reflective being gives you advantage. Perhaps not an advantage in terms of what you are born into, but definitely in terms of the choices you are free to make. This is why you can't be mired down in mindsets and limiting beliefs that rob you of the freedom you need to make good choices, in particular those choices that will help you fulfill your destiny. So don't take your advantage for granted. And just as important, don't let yourself be robbed of your freedom of choice by succumbing primarily to the limiting beliefs imposed by the sometimes short-sighted outer world. Instead, use your position as a human self-reflective being to take an active role in your growth and development so you can co-evolve in a way that empowers you to achieve as much of your potential as possible. In other words, use your God-given self-reflective consciousness to discern the life-giving forces from the life-taking forces so you can nurture your potential rather than destroy it. This unique ability to be conscious of self, of our place on the planet, and in time, is a double-edged sword, as it can be a burden as well as a blessing. Which way it cuts will of course depend on whether consciousness chooses the ego as its center of gravity or the self. If the ego is chosen and it chooses to blindly follow the preordained dictates of the outer world, it will be undermining the full power of consciousness. No doubt it would definitely make things easier if we could just follow the dictates of the outer world, but we can't. The reason the dictates of the outer world don't work is because they use a one-size-fits-all mentality that lacks a sufficient understanding of the inner world of experience to bring about a true coevolution of the inner and outer worlds. The outer world and its collective forces, rather than promoting the growth and development of consciousness, is tending instead to tempt, distract, and dictate to consciousness what it should think. The outer world and its collective forces are more invested in promoting egotism than it is in promoting self-development. Just what this means may be summarized by quoting Carl Jung, who in his autobiography wrote, "When people say I am wise or a sage, I cannot accept it. A man once dipped a hatful of water from a stream. What did that amount to? I am not that stream. I am at the stream, but I do nothing. Other people are at the same stream, but most of them find they have to do something with it. I do nothing. I never think that I am the one who must see to it that cherries grow on stalks. I stand and behold what nature can do. One must stoop a little in order to fetch water from the stream." Jung in this quote is telling us that this stream, as he puts it, and not the ego, is the seat of psychic power. This stream of consciousness, which is nourished by the self, according to Jung, accounts for whatever positive gifts we might bring to fruition. When he says, "Other people are at the same stream, but most of them find they have to do something with it, I do nothing," Dr. Jung is asserting the fact that people too often become overly ego-invested in themselves and wind up manipulating this stream rather than tuning into it and being guided by it. Using metaphorical language, Jung is asserting that we all have within us an innate connection to nature that is there from birth that can be tapped in order to promote greater growth and development. We can, however, lose this connection with nature if the ego overwhelmingly begins to impose its will. Jung finishes by saying, "One must stoop a little in order to fetch water from the stream," which translated means the ego needs to be willing to respect the power and importance of the self as the primary connection to our would-be destiny if it is to guide consciousness properly. The emergence of the ego onto the psychic playing field creates within us a duality that puts us in the position of having choice, more specifically the choice between ego or instinct. Although it is inevitable that the ego will emerge from this instinctual base, it is not inevitable that it will necessarily establish the proper connection to the self or the outer world. In fact, more than ever, today's consciousness makes this connection more difficult to attain. Unfortunately, the outer world today is more invested in pumping up your ego with passionate desires than it is in helping you profit from self-help. This is why you need to know and understand the difference between ego consciousness and a self-reflective consciousness, so you can choose self-health over self-sabotage. If you let the outer world prescribe how you focus your psychic energies, your ability to have a more self-reflective consciousness will be reduced. In other words, you will be like the smaller tree whose growth was stunted because its position relative to the outside world limited its capacity to tap the life-giving forces. So if you want to reclaim your hold on the power to choose, you will need to have an ego consciousness that is able to maintain a connection to the self. This means the ego will need to recognize and respect the needs of the self, so it can better influence consciousness when it comes to interpreting the flow of impulses from the inner world and how they should interact with the outer world. A bad connection between the ego and the self will surely lead to misinterpretation and ultimately to self-sabotage. As such, to best serve the ego needs to recognize, respect, and nurture the self. At the same time, the ego cannot tarnish its relationship with the self by taking credit for what the self can do or by denying the self. These things the ego must do if it wants to successfully transform the past and present into a productive future, if it wants to progress from the simple level of consciousness to the transcendent, and last but not least, if it wants to discern what is toxic to the self from that which is nurturing. To do these things, the ego must learn how to adopt the self as the psyche's center of gravity in a day and age where ego consciousness dominates. This means the ego must learn not to mistake the desire to imitate or its needs for attention, excitement, status, power, and stimulation for its real purpose of furthering the evolution of consciousness. To promote the co-evolution of the inner and outer worlds in a way that furthers consciousness, the ego must develop an awareness that gives it a sense of justice and fairness. To do this, the ego must be able to deal with both pain and pleasure. It must be able to recognize when it is wrong and when it is right. It must be able to say "I'm sorry" as well as show appreciation. The ego needs to be able to value both hurt and happiness. Likewise, the ego needs to tame discouragement and distraction as they can block growth and development. The ego needs to do all of these things so it can choose wisely. Because evolution at the individual level is slow and gradual, the ego needs to make a lifelong commitment to these things. Such a commitment is needed if the ego is going to successfully resolve the challenge that each year of life puts on us to grow and develop. It is important to achieve the growth that each year demands from us if we don't want to get further and further behind. Since each year of life represents one cycle in the growth process, it becomes imperative that we recognize that growing and learning is a lifelong operation. Therefore, if the ego is going to help consciousness reach the transcendent level of consciousness, it will have to complete many cycles. This means your ego cannot let itself get carried away with quick fixes or shortcuts. To further its commitment to the evolution of consciousness, the ego must be able to make good choices when it comes to filling the mental, emotional, and spiritual moment-by-moment voids of everyday life. It must make choices that promote and nurture destiny. It needs to make the choices that will properly balance ego needs with the needs of the self. The ego needs such a balance so it can better manage opposing forces, such that where there is temptation, there can also be restraint. Where there is distraction, there can be focus. And where there is an ego invested in the lower instincts, there can be a self devoted to the higher instincts. Because consciousness is by and large determined by how we fill the voids in our lives, it becomes clear just how important it is that the ego recognize the self and its instinctual need to propel us from within to fulfill a unique destiny. This destiny can be spoiled, however, if the ego doesn't limit the amount of time and energy it spends filling the gaps in awareness with unrealistic wishful thinking, worry, fantasies of gloom and doom, nothingness, or with a steady stream of activities designed to escape the responsibilities of life. To make healthy choices in this regard, the ego needs to be able to separate purpose from just passing time, purpose from passion, and purpose from playing roles and games. Effectively filling the gaps in awareness and time with some sort of self-developing activity is important, not only for the evolution of your personal consciousness, but also for all of humanity. Metaphorically speaking, it's like what happens to a clear glass of water when you put a drop of iodine in it. That one drop changes the color of the entire glass of water. Understanding this metaphor means you understand the far-reaching implications that the proper development of consciousness holds, not only for you as an individual, but also for the species as a whole. Perhaps now you can better understand why I say that your life is a thread in a tapestry that brightly shines. The ego, because of its need for stimulation and excitement, will certainly try to escape the uncomfortable feelings of the moment-to-moment voids created by the nothingness that fills the gaps in awareness produced by opposing forces. The ego's favorite way to fill these voids is by following fad fashion and imitation. Escaping the aloneness of the moment-to-moment voids by such means in the long run only serves to betray the self. Rather than trying to escape the nothingness, the ego needs to know the self so it can fill the voids with choices that will nurture the emerging self rather than always looking to the outer world for a substitute. If the ego fails to be guided by this emerging self and instead chooses to follow fad fashion and imitation, destiny will be denied. If the emerging self is not recognized and respected, then a false self will take its place. This false self, in order to maintain its legitimacy, will infect consciousness with distorted perception and meaning in order to validate itself. If the emerging self is not recognized and respected by the ego and instead is replaced by a false self, it will produce problems in the ability to feel involved. The funny thing is you won't see it coming until it hits you. Instead of feeling involved and present, all of a sudden everything will be seen as a chore or as boring. Fantasy, being the powerful force that it is, needs a healthy ego so it can promote the co-evolution of the inner and outer worlds in a way that lets destiny deliver. This is why this prescription has focused so much on helping you organize your ego, so you can free yourself of the limiting beliefs, mindsets, and prejudices that you have and don't know you have, but nonetheless cut you off from that stream of consciousness emerging out of the self. In order to help fantasy fill the gaps in awareness with realness and what will best serve the self-health system of mind, body, and spirit, the ego must be able to judge which fantasies are right for the self and which ones are wrong. In other words, it must be able to counterbalance fantasies, such as fantasies of seduction with fantasies of sincerity, fantasies based in insecurity with fantasies of security, and fantasies based on impulse with fantasies of inhibition. If the ego is not able to balance fantasy in this way, huge gaps will develop between your potential and its fulfillment. If the ego fails to counterbalance by using the opposing fantasy, it will succumb more and more to prejudice, obsessive thinking, bad habits, fear, or excuses that keep it from successfully filling developmental gaps. If it is unable to counterbalance by using the opposing fantasy, it will be less effective at connecting you to what is meaningful and purposeful because you will have become too one-sided. The more fantasy is engaged in prejudice thinking, mindsets, and one-sided thinking, the more controlling and unhealthy the ego becomes. This is why it is crucial that the ego remain humble enough to engage fantasy in a decision-making process that can meaningfully fill the moment-to-moment voids with the life-giving forces that flow from this stream of consciousness created by the emerging self. If we again use Jeffrey Dahmer as an example of someone whose ego is not able to counterbalance by using opposing fantasies, we see what can happen to the life-giving forces of the self and the higher instincts. Because his higher needs for love and belonging were not met as a child or as an adolescent, Dahmer retreated into a fantasy world of sex and aggression. These fantasies filled the void left behind by these unmet needs. Dahmer's ego became fixated with sexually aggressive fantasies because his deep-seated feelings of neglect and loneliness prevented him from tapping that stream of consciousness created by the self. Because his ego was fixated in this manner, it was split off from the self, and therefore he was unable to counterbalance his sexually aggressive fantasies with self-developing fantasies. As the split grew larger and larger, his fantasies progressed and became less and less socially acceptable. As they became less and less socially acceptable, he became more and more disconnected from the self and others, leading to a twisted co-evolutionary process. The neglect, rejection, failure, pain, and suffering that seemed to follow Jeffrey Dahmer proved to be too much for his ego to handle. As such, his ego found solace in escaping into a world of sexual and homicidal fantasies. Because these fantasies were used over and over again as a means of escape, they took on a life of their own.
It's puzzling. I don't think I've ever seen anything quite like this before.
Disconnected from self and others, Dahmer was forced to abandon realness and instead had to wear a mask to hide his twisted thinking. He wore this mask to delude the outside world into thinking that he was normal. Even though he was effective at using this mask, it did nothing to help him or to prevent his fantasies from finding their way into reality and eventually becoming uncontrollable. Obviously, such a corrupt existence shouldn't have been Dahmer's destiny. His ego, disconnected as it was, had no choice but to succumb to these sexual and homicidal fantasies. His ego, disconnected as it was unable to receive and interpret the flow of impulses from the inner world in a way that would allow him to co-evolve with the outer world in a life-giving manner. The idea that the ego needs to be properly organized around the self and the higher instincts of the inner core is given additional support when we look at the life experiences of Robert Tomei. Like Dahmer, Tomei's ego had to cope with a traumatic set of experiences, but unlike Dahmer, Tomei's ego was able to come to a successful resolution. Robert Tomei's story shows that it's possible for the ego and the self to come together even after undergoing a traumatic split, if the right choices are made. For Mr. Tomei, the split between the ego and the self came about not as a result of neglect, but instead as a result of suffering a broken neck while playing high school football. This crippling injury was obviously devastating to his psychic equilibrium. Confronted with such a demoralizing loss, his ego naturally and automatically filled the gap between the present and the future with the attitude that there was no future. To put it in his words, it was like I was dead. Since his ego so quickly adopted this mindset, it literally prevented him from making a good adjustment for over 9 years. This attitude that life was over, as well as other mindsets, disabled him even further because they were ineffectual at giving him access to the life-giving forces contained in his higher instincts that would have helped him transcend the loss of his body. It wasn't just the belief that life was over that handicapped Mr. Tomei, but also the belief that putting a pen in his mouth was ugly. Beliefs such as these prevented him from tapping and expressing potentials that were still intact. Because of these mindsets, his consciousness was unable to transcend his tragic injury. After years of depression and even an unsuccessful suicide attempt, his ego finally reached a point where it was willing to change its thinking. The first step in his change process came when he decided to stop being angry with God and instead decided to reestablish a relationship with God. In so doing, he told God that if he had to be this way, that he didn't want to be alone. Coincidence or not, it was around this same time that he met the woman that would eventually become his wife. This woman and her 2 children, who for him were sent by God, became his inspiration for living. This would have never happened had his ego not relinquished some of its mindsets and limiting beliefs. The simple yet difficult shift from feelings of hopelessness and helplessness to an openness that there was life after tragedy opened the door for him to find meaning rather than nothingness and intimacy rather than loneliness. The shift allowed the co-evolution between the inner and outer world to once again resume in a self-developing manner. His new relationship with God, as well as his new family, set in motion a positive domino effect. Meeting his wife not only allowed him to find love and belonging, it also became the inspiration to put a pen in his mouth and renew his boyhood hobby of drawing. She became the spark that ignited his motivation to work at it seriously. Doing the drawing led to writing poetry and to the discovery, as he put it, that there are a lot of ideas churning in my head trying to get out. By choosing to make the shift and breaking free of the bonds of his particular limited thinking, he was once again able to draw from that instinctual stream of consciousness so necessary for self-development. More specifically, the will to live, to belong, to have purpose and meaning, to give and receive love and respect, and to engage in self-expression. This positive domino effect brought about by his newly restructured ego didn't end with the acquisition of a special relationship with God, with finding a family, or even with the expression of his artistic talents. It took him even further. It not only allowed him to find purpose and meaning in these things, but also in meeting with victims of severe spinal cord injuries. Like Christopher Reeve, who found new purpose and meaning by becoming an advocate for a cure for spinal cord injuries, Mr. Tomei found purpose in trying to help those with injuries like his own. Because of his newfound devotion to life and the presence it provided him, he could serve as an inspiration to those like him. To help them see what is possible in spite of their condition, he begins his talk by showing his drawings and by telling them of his injuries. He discloses further by sharing with them the fact that he was in a deep depression for 9 years and that he tried to commit suicide. He tells them that to get better, he had to get to the point where he could accept himself the way he was and to once again have the desire to live. He takes great pains, however, to paint a realistic picture, as he admits that even though he has made the adjustment, he still finds it hard to live as a quadriplegic. Nevertheless, he also lets them know that with the help of God, he has not lost too much. He tells them that he had to get to the point where there were more important things than his body, like his wife, his kids, and his artwork, which for him were all from God. Although his unfortunate injury cost him his mind, body, and spirit for 9 years, he was still able to eventually make the choices that would allow him to reconnect with and give expression to the life forces. In helping those like him to do the same, he finishes his talks by saying, "Find your focus and don't let anything stop you. That's the only thing that's going to bring you out of yourself, because you are going to get that dignity and that pride, and that's all you need. And once you have that attitude and once you have that certainty, then it doesn't matter anymore. It really doesn't." This example shows how the ego, if properly organized and connected to the self and the higher instincts of the inner core, can transcend even something as tragic as a crippling spinal cord injury. By looking at Mr. Tomei's story from the self-health perspective, you can better appreciate how the collective could not, with its one-size-fits-all approach, possibly provide for the peculiar needs of the individual. In fact, it failed to do so for over 9 years. The one-size-fits-all approach fails because the self, trapped in the vortex of mind, body, and spirit, is what mobilizes and unites each of these dimensions of consciousness so we can move towards our specific style of self-development. If Robert Tomei can transcend such a devastating injury by choosing the proper ego organization, then we see what is possible for any one of us. And if he can overcome the horrible circumstances of quadriplegia, then those of us more fortunate than him in this regard have no excuse. To help you co-evolve with strength and durability, Letting Destiny Deliver has come up with the Triple Protection System. The Triple Protection System, if used effectively, will ensure your ability to adapt and co-evolve with strength and determination. The Triple Protection System is comprised of 3 indispensable ingredients that must be understood and practiced if you want to tap the stream of consciousness that best keeps you connected to the life-giving forces. The 3 active ingredients in the Triple Protection System are replenishing, removing, and reintegrating. Essentially, what this means is that if you want the relationship between the ego and the self to be restorative rather than toxic, you will need to make a concerted effort to use the Triple Protection System in your decision-making process. For example, to effectively use the Triple Protection System, you need to replenish the body with nutrients or rest after effort has been expended. You need to replenish the mind through self-reflection after so much experience. You also need to replenish the spirit by establishing new goals when existing goals have been accomplished or are no longer applicable. The Triple Protection Plan says you not only need to replenish, you also need to remove the toxic. The toxic must be removed from the body through exercise, massage, or the like. In the same way, the toxic must be removed from the mind by removing prejudices and all forms of rigid thinking. In terms of the spirit, the toxic must be removed by removing the self-doubt and discouragement that lead to giving up or self-sabotage. Finally, the Triple Protection Plan says you need to make a concerted effort to reintegrate. This you must do if you want to best benefit from replenishing and removing. Reintegration is the process whereby newly acquired information is assimilated in a synergistic way with existing knowledge and positive potentials. For example, we reintegrate as a body when we exercise to allow our daily intake of food to build a stronger and better body. We reintegrate as a mind by getting the proper sleep, so daily experiences can be reintegrated during REM or dream sleep. And at the spiritual level, we reintegrate by having the ability to take pain and suffering and using it to acquire greater purpose and meaning. Using the Triple Protection System allows the mind, body, and spirit to tap vital sources of information needed to maintain vigor. By using the Triple Protection System, you will be better able to incorporate day-to-day experiences and its teachings to promote self-knowledge and self-health. Finally, by using the Triple Protection System, you will be better able to more meaningfully fill the moment-to-moment voids. Using this system will improve your ability to move through the various dimensions of time and space. This Triple Protection System is such an important part of the self-health prescription that it warrants going into greater detail. First of all, replenishing is important because it provides the nurturance needed to maintain health and to promote growth. This part of the protection system can be helped or hindered by how much self-health intelligence the ego possesses. This is why it is unfortunate that today's high-tech, information-rich society has done so much to improve the technological side of our lives, but little to improve the human side of our lives. By facilitating such a one-sided development, it has made it more difficult to distinguish the nourishing from the toxic, and in the process lowered the average person's self-health intelligence. It has also overdosed us with so much information that it has become harder and harder to not only discern the toxic from the nurturing, but also to integrate all this information. If such a trend continues, it will become more and more difficult for the ego to have the self-health awareness it needs to make good choices. The ego, therefore, to protect itself from poor decision-making, must acquire the self-health intelligence it needs to choose correctly. In other words, it needs to be able to choose that which is replenishing from that which is toxic, so it can know what needs to be removed and be able to remove it and make room for the newly acquired information. Without self-health intelligence, the ego will not be able to counteract the addictive nature of the toxic, which includes removing it. Without self-health intelligence, the toxic, when introduced into consciousness, is more likely to fixate the ego with constant cravings for more and more, rather than promoting the ego to remove it so it can replenish and reintegrate. To avert this calamity, the ego must have self-health intelligence. This is especially important because regardless of how undesirable the toxic may seem, it still has the capacity to delude the mind, body, or spirit into thinking and feeling that there is nothing wrong with it. This is how we find ourselves over and over again choosing the toxic over the nurturing. Without self-health intelligence, the ego is more likely to delude itself about the toxic, thus opening the floodgates to toxic excess. This is why people often have to hit bottom before the allure of the toxic is diminished. The ability of the ego to choose the nurturing over the toxic is vital to the Triple Protection System, as all three ingredients are inextricably tied to each other. For example, the ability to replenish is tied to the ability to remove, because if you can't remove the destructive, it's hard to make room for the nurturing. And if you can't make room for the nurturing, there is no way it can be assimilated or reintegrated. Therefore, removing the toxic is just as important as replenishing, because when it comes to effectively filling the gaps in awareness as a mind, body, and spirit, both of these things have to happen if new information is to be properly integrated and reintegrated. This ability to replenish is essential because you must restock in order to reintegrate. Likewise, the ability to remove and integrate is essential because just as the body has to remove the nutrients from food in order to assimilate it, the mind has to remove limited thinking so it can be reshaped by the possibilities that lie beyond limited thinking. In a similar fashion, spirituality has to remove the meaningful from pain or adversity in order to make the experience constructive rather than destructive.
It's deja vu. This moment's happened before.
Being able to replenish, remove, and reintegrate are necessary in order to empower the ego to help the self become resistant to toxic elements. The less able you are at using these processes, the more vulnerable you will be to filling the gaps created by opposing forces with toxic processes like smoking, excessive sleep, anger, vindictiveness, jealousy, envy, gossip, prejudice, or self-doubt. So think twice about how you choose to use the time you have and about using the triple protection system. In conclusion, let me say that what you fill the moment-to-moment gaps in the awareness of mind, body, and spirit with will end up either nurturing the self-health system or sabotaging it. How you fill the moment-to-moment gaps in the awareness of mind, body, and spirit will, for the most part, be determined by the ego. The reason being, consciousness is determined by how the ego attends to the self and promotes a co-evolutionary process with the outside world. Therefore, it is imperative that the ego have the self-health intelligence it needs to avoid the mindsets and limiting beliefs that prevent it from having the freedom to choose self-development over self-sabotage. This concludes Part 10 of the Self-Health Prescription, Letting Destiny Deliver.